Hi everyone, my name is Alexander Zalivako, and I'm the founder of From A to Z law firm. One of the areas of our expertise are sanctions, and in a series of presentations called Sanctions 360 Degrees, we will look into major sanctions economic regimes and the way they affect the lives of private individuals and corporations. Thank you very much for watching. We will discuss in these presentations existing economic sanctions against Iraq. And Iraq is a bit of an outlier with a positive connotation in our series Sanctions 360, because unlike many other, if not all, of the jurisdictions which we've considered, Iraq is a rare example when the sanctions regimes which are relevant for dealing with this country have been largely abolished, and the existing sanctions are basically limiting trade in arms and protecting the cultural objects of Iraq, as well as the collateral effect of those sanctions programs, which are pursued by various states with respect to Iran or different terrorist groups which are present in the region. Nevertheless, Iraq is certainly one of the key examples of a comprehensive UN embargo which has been lifted. It's an important country for trade in oil, in the international supply of energy. And for that reason, a short presentation dealing with this country, we trust, would be of relevance and interest for those who are assessing the sanctions risks of dealing with various jurisdictions. And we will do what we typically do in our presentations. We would make a brief summary of the key political and historical events which are relevant to understand the current sanctions programs in place against Iraq. Then we would look into the substance of those restrictions which still remain in place, both at the UN level as well as national levels. And we would conclude by looking at the key sector of the Iraqi economy, the energy and oil sector, which would be of primary interest for most of the investors. Let's set the stage for this presentation by summarizing those key factors in Iraq, which result in certain restrictions being still in place with respect to this country, which can be qualified as sanctions. A bit of history. Following the Gulf War, the United Nations imposed a comprehensive trade embargo against Iraq, which in essence prohibited trade in almost everything. There is much literature and much criticism of those type of sanctions and the effect they had on the civil population of the country, and limited effect they had on Saddam Hussein's regime itself. Luckily, as of today, those sanctions are history, because in 2003, the coalition led by the United States overthrew the regime of Saddam Hussein. And following those events, the United Nations largely lifted the comprehensive embargo and put in place that sanction program, which we have as of today, which is largely limited to trade in arms and sensitive technologies to ensure that Iraq does not have access to the weapons of mass destruction. Another important factor, which results in certain designations with respect to the persons operating within the territory of Iraq, is the civil war, which happened in late 10th from 13 to 17, whereby ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and various other terrorist groups, in essence, took control over large parts of the country. Following their overthrow and reinstatement of the current government of Iraq, various persons were designated in connection with those events as well. Final point to note is that Iraq is not a unitary state. It has a substantial minority of Kurdish population living in the north, which enjoy an autonomous status within the state of Iraq. And there is a substantial dispute between the central government of Iraq, located in Baghdad, and the Kurdistan regional government as to the use of the main resource of the country, which is oil. Most of the Iraqi oil reserves are located in the south of the country and are exported by sea through the Gulf and then to the main consumers of Iraqi crude, which are today China, India, and Korea. However, there are also substantial oil reserves located in the north of the country, around the cities of Mosul or Kirkuk, which are currently controlled by the Kurdistan regional government. The central government insists of having the monopoly on the exports of crude, whereas the local authorities insist that they should be permitted to export their part of crude themselves, or at least get from the central budget a proportionate compensation for that crude which is actually extracted in the north. The exports from the north will be different than those from the south, both in terms of the means of transport and the destinations. The main market will be Turkey, and the main means of transportation will be an oil pipeline, which actually links the crude oil fields of the northern part of Iraq with Turkey and the port of Ceyhan. We will now look at the UN sanctions still in place against Iraq. They are important because all UN member states are obliged to implement those sanctions in their national laws. And as we would see going forward in this presentation, largely currently national regimes are related to the implementation of the UN regime and do not go more than that in general terms, of course. Key resolution as to the current sanctions regime against Iraq is Resolution 1483, which ended the comprehensive embargo against the country and, in essence, put in place the existing regime, which can be summarized in follows. Arms embargo is in place with respect to Iraq. Then, up until 2013, there existed a special mechanism for payments for Iraqi petroleum products, crude, and natural gas exports, which were coordinated by the Development Fund of Iraq, a unit of the central bank, and certain immunity rights were granted to those proceeds as well as commodities. Third pillar is the regime which relates to the trade in Iraqi archaeological and cultural goods. Due to the original conflict which occurred in 2003, as well as the subsequent events of 2013, 2017, when ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and different other terrorist groups substantially looted the cultural heritage of Iraq. International community put in place the regime which purpose is to restore those cultural heritage to the country to which it belongs, to Iraq. And then finally, a limited asset, travels ban freeze remains in place, largely with respect to the persons associated with the regime of Saddam Hussein. But more recently, various jurisdictions, specifically the United States, also impose asset freeze and travel ban sanctions with respect to the individuals who may be classified as terrorists or engage in trade with Iran. When I look at the US sanctions, which are set out in the 3 executive orders summarized in the slide, as well as the Iraq stabilization and insurgency sanctions regulations, which in essence replicate the provisions of those executive orders. And in summary, they replicate the existing UN sanctions restrictions with respect to Iraq, which we discussed earlier. An important part of the US sanctions program, including with respect to Iraq, is that there are many designations which would be relevant for dealing with Iraq, which are not made under those executive orders which are listed on the slide and are specifically dealing with the situation in the country. More specifically, most of the recent designations where an Iraqi company will be designated are made under the United States-Iran sanctions regime, and the designations are made for engaging in trade with Iran designated persons or under the terrorist sanctions regime of the United States. The key restriction which is currently in place with respect to Iraq are actually restrictions flowing from export administration regulations administered by the Department of Commerce in the United States, and more specifically by its agency called Bureau of Industry and Security. And those restrictions continue to consider Iraq as one of the countries subject to embargo type restrictions, despite all the developments which we discussed at the beginning. And the net result of this is the export or re-export or moving within Iraq of any items which are subject to the export administration regulations, which in essence would regulate any type of dual use or sensitive technology goods of US origin, require a license. As is standard with these regulations, same license will be required for any foreign goods, for example, which incorporate US components above a certain threshold. The UK and EU sanctions are summarized in the slide and may be described as largely limited to the implementation of the UN international sanctions, namely arms embargo with respect to the country, limited asset freeze sanctions imposed largely on the regime of Saddam Hussein, his close family members, and other affiliates, together with the travel ban for the same persons, as well as the sanctions in place, which are aimed at restoring cultural and historical heritage to Iraq. On the last slide, we would specifically discuss dealing with the energy sector of Iraq today. The reason for specifically discussing this sector is its importance for the economy of the country. In essence, energy and specifically oil accounts for most of the GDP and over 90% of the export proceeds of Iraq, and certainly that's where the primary interest of international business lies. Many multinationals are present in the country, including such names as, for example, BP, Total Energies, Lukoil. And it's important to note that although immediately after the overthrow of Saddam Hussein's regime, there were certain restrictions operated at the UN level with respect to how the oil and petroleum products, as well as natural gas of Iraq, may be exported. Those restrictions related to the obligation to pay proceeds from those exports to the Development Fund for Iraq, as well as granting limited immunity rights for those commodities as well as the proceeds, limited in time. That mechanism has ended by now more than 10 years ago. And in essence, there are no restrictions, at least as far as international sanctions are concerned, of dealing with the petroleum, crude, or natural gas products of Iraqi origin, or investing into the sectors of the Iraqi economy, subject to the export restrictions, which we discussed earlier on some sensitive technology, which may be involved in this sector. One final remark is that there is an ongoing dispute between the central government of Iraq and the Kurdistan regional government as to the development of those oil reserves which are located in the north of the country, where the KRG exercises authority. And this creates certain risks with respect to the operators in the region. Nevertheless, the matter is largely of a constitutional issue of dividing the powers between the two governments, whereby, in essence, the central government would wish to assert its overall monopoly rights over the export of Iraqi crude and natural gas, as well as petroleum products, whereas the local government would either wish to increase its share of distributions from the federal budget commensurate with the crude developed in the north, or get autonomous rights for the export of crude. These matters of constitutional risks are what they are. The relevant risks would need to be considered in the relevant contractual setting. Thank you very much for watching. I trust that you found this presentation useful, and I hope to see you during my next presentations.